Dear learners, welcome to this session. Today we are going to discuss about secondary sources of information. In our earlier session, we have discussed about categorization of information sources, categorization as given by different thinkers and primary sources of information. This session is basically helps you in knowing about the secondary sources of information. The basic objectives of this session is to articulate the advantages of secondary sources of information, to highlight the main types of secondary sources, to outline some of the main examples of secondary sources of information, and to help the readers or the users of information to recognize these secondary sources of information. As we have discussed in our earlier sessions also, we divide information sources into two parts: documentary sources of information and non-documentary sources of information. In documentary sources of information, if we do the categorization according to their content, then it will be of primary sources of information, secondary sources of information and tertiary sources of information. So, today our focus will be on secondary sources of information. These secondary type of information sources is generated by gathering information from primary sources. The information gathered from primary sources is compiled in systematic order and published in the form of books, journals, etc. These types of sources are known as secondary sources. If you remember, primary sources are first to publish in the production cycle. They report the original, updated and first time published contents. These secondary sources, they compile the information given in primary sources. That is why they are known as secondary sources of information. A secondary source interprets and analyzes primary source of information. These secondary sources of information offer an analysis or an restatement of an event or discovery described in primary sources. They interpret, explain or summarize primary sources, means their existence totally depends upon the primary sources. Whatsoever is there in the primary sources, secondary sources are consolidating it, compiling it, summarizing it, explaining it and presenting it in a different repackaged format. Now, coming some of the features of these secondary sources of information. These secondary sources of information, they present the in-depth analysis of primary sources of information. They summarize, evaluate and analytically interpret primary information and present it in a personalized perspective. They are not just evidence based, they are useful sources of information to give the information as contained in the primary sources of information. These secondary sources of information, they are the published works, means they are not unpublished, they are published and they gather information from the primary sources which can be used to locate additional information about the research. Then let us see some examples of secondary sources of information. We have biographical works, we have commentaries, criticisms, histories, magazines and newspaper articles, except eyewitness accounts, original reporting or analysis. Books are also secondary sources of information, but other than fiction and autobiography type of books. Similarly, bibliographies, reference books including dictionaries, encyclopedias, atlases, articles from magazines, journals, newspapers, etc. Similarly, literature reviews and review articles, for example, movie reviews, book reviews, history books and other popular or scholarly books, works of criticisms and interpretation, treatises, textbooks which are compiled according to the definite syllabus, and indexing and abstracting services. All these are the examples of secondary sources of information. Now, we will see the main type of secondary sources of information one by one. In this category, the first is secondary periodicals. If you remember, in primary sources also we have discussed about periodicals, but periodicals comes under both categories, primary and secondary. If they are publishing the research related information, research articles, research reports, research papers, then they comes under the category of primary periodicals. But a secondary periodical may be defined as a periodic publication that disseminates information contained in primary sources in various forms such as index, abstract, digest, accounts, etc. So, now we will see what type of secondary periodicals are there. In the category of secondary periodicals, first is indexing periodicals. Indexing periodical is a periodical publication that includes the bibliographical details of an article or the document. It does not provide any abstract, means a periodical which is just containing the indexing part, not the abstract part of other publications, is known as a abstract indexing periodical. These indexing periodicals, they are arranged properly, they are having their class numbers also, and they are subject wise also. Many of these periodicals also bring out their indexes, subject indexes, and some of the indexing periodicals, they contain sometimes abstracts also, little bit abstract, but not that much as detailed as given in abstracting periodicals. So, these indexing periodicals are very popular for knowing about the details of a subject whatsoever publications are there on an specific subject. These indexing periodicals, they keep the researchers, scientists aware about what is publishing in their area of interest. They may or may not be long, or they are just related to a particular subject. For example, a famous indexing periodical is Reader's Guide to Periodical Literature. It is published from New York and it is published by H.W. Wilson. Then comes Express Information Bulletin. These Express Information Bulletins, they are not much popular otherwise, but they are very popular in Russia. It is a secondary periodical published mostly in Russia and contains detailed summary of the article along with the mathematical formulas, calculations and illustrations. It resembles an abstracting periodicals, but contains much more detailed information. So, they are just like the abstracting periodicals, but details are much more than the abstracting periodicals. These express information bulletins, they are devoted to narrow subjects like science and technology, computer engineering, informatics, radio engineering, etc. Means they are related to very specific type of subjects. Then comes the abstracting periodicals. These are also of secondary in nature because they are publishing the abstracts of the research article which are already published in the primary periodicals. An abstracting periodical is a periodical publication that contains an abstract of the publication in addition to the bibliographical details. The abstract may be informative, means detailed abstract, or indicative, means just the small abstract, to give the users a clear idea about abstracting periodical. So, in this way these abstracting periodicals, they are just not providing the details what is publishing, but they are also providing the abstract so that the users will become familiar of the contents also. One example of abstracting periodical is Indian Library Science Abstract. This is published by ISLIC, Kolkata. Then comes the popular periodicals. A popular periodicals, as this name is saying, is a periodical publication that usually serves common people, students, technicians and other those who are interested in some popular kind of information. These periodicals contain popular items in a very lucid style, and they are presented likewise to attract the users or the readers of that particular periodical. The main purpose of this periodical is to present the information or the knowledge in such a way that it will become interesting to the readers of that publication. Learned or other type of articles are not found in this type of popular periodicals. They are just to give the information in the lucid and in the interesting and attractive way. Then comes the technical periodicals. A technical periodical is a periodical publication devoted to the technical subject. In many cases, a technical periodical includes some primary information also, but this primary information is compiled from the primary sources. That is why technical periodicals comes under the category of secondary sources of information. These periodicals are usually bought out by commercial organizations to present to the users the technical information related to any product or service. Then comes the trade journals. These journals are meant for the purpose of providing trade related information to the users. Many type of trade journals are available in the market. We often call them trade literature or trade publications also, and the purpose of these trade journals is to popularize the publications of the publishers or the manufacturers, etc. In many cases these trade journals, they are available free of cost, and they are because the purpose of these trade journals is to promote the product and services of the manufacturers. Then comes the house journals. These house journals, they are published by some industrial or commercial organizations or industrial houses or scientific or research organizations, or sometimes even by educational institutions also. Means the internal publication which contains all the details about that organization or institution. These house journals also comes under the category of secondary sources of information, because they contains all the activities, all the happenings that was there in that particular institution or organization. These periodicals are usually called house journals and appear in various forms, sometimes in the form of a brochure or a leaflet, or even in a proper periodical format also. And nowadays these house journals, they are becoming digital also. Now the second type of secondary source is bibliographies. These bibliographies is a list of documents arranged in systematic order. Each entry provides the bibliographical details of the document. These bibliographies are of various types, like universal bibliography. See, the name tells universal, a bibliography which covers all the publications of the world. A universal bibliography is that which lists all documents of all types of materials produced in all countries, all languages, at any time and on any theme. That is why it is known as universal bibliography. Then comes the national bibliography. Universal means of the whole world, national means of a particular nation. National bibliography lists the publications produced from a nation. They may appear in the form of a book or a periodical. It does not however list all the publications sometime, but generally it covers all the publications of a nation. For example, Indian National Bibliography, British National Bibliographies, these are the national bibliographies of India and Britain. Then comes the trade bibliography. These trade bibliographies are bought out by commercial publishers like booksellers, distributors, printers and other types of publishing related agents. Normally these bibliographies list books which are meant for sale. The scope of these bibliographies is generally national. Some of them are also international. Usually they cover all subjects that are arranged alphabetically subject wise. They are mostly used as book selection tools because they provide the details of the books published by a publisher during a particular time. So, they helps the libraries in book selection. Then comes selective bibliographies. A selective bibliography, this is a specific type of a bibliography. It does not cover all the documents on the topic. They are selective in nature and this selection is done based upon some criteria. These bibliographies may appear in the form of book or a periodical. Then comes the bibliography of early printed books. These bibliographies generally include books which are published in the 15th or the 16th century, means early printed books are listed in this type of bibliographies. Then comes the list of periodicals. The list of periodicals appears in the form of directories, union catalogues, alphabetical list, etc. The bibliographical details of each entry contains information about the periodical. Maximum details are given so that to identify the periodicals easily. So, like bibliography is a list of the books, this is the list of the periodicals. Then comes the list of theses and dissertations. So, list of books, then list of periodicals, then we are having list of theses and dissertations also. This publication lists the theses and dissertations produced by any institution. For example, any university, say IGNOU, we are having research in IGNOU and a list prepared all the which is listing all the theses and dissertations available in IGNOU is the list of theses and dissertations. These are generally arranged alphabetically or subject wise, and sometimes they are arranged chronologically also. So, they tells about all the thesis and dissertation of a particular institution. Then comes the subject bibliographies. A subject bibliography is also a bibliography, but the difference is that it only lists the documents of a particular or a given subject. For example, a bibliography on physics, chemistry or library and information science, any subject you can say. So, subject bibliography lists only a particular subject. Then comes the author bibliography. So, we are talking about author bibliography. A author bibliography lists all the publications by a single author. A author bibliography is also known as biobibliography or author bibliography or an individual bibliography. It lists the works of a single author in a bibliography. So, this list provides a comprehensive detail or comprehensive list of works done by a particular author. So, that is why it is called as a author bibliography. Sometimes these author bibliographies includes works by other author also on that author. Then comes the bibliography of anonymous and pseudonymous works. These type of bibliographies includes books by anonymous authors, books by pseudonymous authors, means whose authorship is not known. This type of bibliographies list those publications. The third category in secondary sources of information is list of research in progress. It is a list which tells about the research going on in any specific field, like research organizations, institutions, laboratories, universities, they are doing research. Higher education institutions, they are doing research, they are engaged in research, and this list tells us about the research which is going on in these organizations or institutions. This list is very necessary for two purposes. One, to know about the progress, and second, to avoid the duplication, because until unless a research knows about what is going on in other organization, he or she will not be able to stop the duplication in choosing his or her research topic. Then comes the fourth category of secondary sources of information. These are reference sources of information. Reference sources means the source which are there only for reference, means we are not going to read these sources from first page to the last page like we read the textbook. These reference sources are meant for ready reference, means a query is there and to resolve that query you are going to consult a dictionary, encyclopedia or a directory, whatever may be the case. The purpose of these resources is to provide information particularly on any topic, query which is readily available in these reference sources. There are many type of reference sources as I just mentioned, like directories, yearbooks, almanacs, dictionaries, handbooks, manuals, many are there. But we are going to know about these reference sources in a different session, because this topic is very much comprehensive and it is not possible to complete all the reference sources in one go. So, what we will do? We will have a different session on these reference sources. So, this way today we have discussed about secondary sources of information. Secondary sources of information describe, summarize or discuss information or details originally presented in another sources, means primary sources. In most of the cases these secondary sources of information, they are totally based or totally dependent on the primary sources of information. This type of source is written for a broader audience and will include definition of disciplines, specific terms, sometimes they include history, sometimes they include some theories and principles, summaries of major studies and events and other related topics. So, use of these secondary sources of information give a overview of a topic. They are very useful to know about the primary sources of information. They provide a type of a bibliographical control for our primary sources of information, because in absence of secondary sources of information, a researcher or a user will not be able to know about the primary sources, how many primary sources are available for his or her use. So, this way these secondary sources of information are equally important for our researchers, scientists and users. In the next session, we will discuss about the reference sources of information. Thank you. Happy learning.